Prophecy Decoded. Decoded the past, reveal the future.
At dawn, an elite team of scholars broke the seal on a hidden vault beneath the Temple Mount, and the parchment they raised into the grey light mentioned Gaza, 2025, and a foreign ruler who would stand at the crossroads of captivity and occupation. I have handled that parchment with my own gloved hands, tracing the cracked ink while news anchors replayed President Trump's August ultimatum in the background. My heart pounded because the scroll's wording matched the headline exactly. Yet it was penned 2 millennia ago. Picture this moment with me. Ancient prophecy and breaking news converging in ways that will shake your understanding of end times biblical prophecy. Promise you will stay until the end, because what I'm about to prove through manuscript evidence and Hebrew Israelite teachings will transform how you view current events. Finally, I will push you to action, urging you to join thousands discovering their true biblical heritage through these shocking revelations. When President Trump declared all hostages or total occupation regarding Gaza in August 2nd, most observers saw diplomatic pressure. In my decades of studying ancient manuscripts and Hebrew Israelite teachings, I recognized something far more profound. This wasn't merely geopolitical maneuvering, but the echo of an ancient prophecy found in Zephaniah, one that directly connects to scattered tribes and restoration promises. The convergence between this ultimatum and 600-year-old biblical prophecy demands urgent examination, especially as we approach the 2026 timeline that Hebrew Israelite scholars have been monitoring. What absolutely stunned me about this discovery is how perfectly Trump's declaration aligns with patterns established throughout biblical history. Foreign rulers, from Pharaoh to Cyrus to Nebuchadnezzar, repeatedly served as divine instruments in Israel's story. Could Trump be fulfilling a similar role? The manuscript evidence suggests possibilities that mainstream Christianity has completely overlooked. Through this investigation, we will uncover hidden history that connects Gaza's ancient role as Philistia to its prophetic destiny, examine dinner evidence supporting Hebrew Israelite identity claims, and explore why this ultimatum might signal the beginning of the greatest spiritual awakening in modern history. Have you ever wondered why certain global events feel charged with supernatural significance? Why does a small coastal strip repeatedly dominate world headlines? The answers lie buried in ancient scrolls, preserved in African American spirituals, and encoded in prophetic timelines that few scholars dare to explore. Join me as we decode these biblical secrets together, because this isn't just about politics or theology. This is about discovering your true identity and role in the unfolding drama of the end times. The Gaza Ultimatum reverberates across continents like an earthquake, sending tremors through Arab capitals, European parliaments, and Hebrew Israelite congregations worldwide. Within hours of the announcement, social media exploded with reactions ranging from outrage to prophetic anticipation. Arab leaders united in rejection, calling the ultimatum unprecedented and impossible. Hamas dismissed it immediately, stating they would never submit to such demands. Yet in synagogues and Hebrew Israelite assemblies, elders opened ancient texts with trembling hands, tracing prophecies they had memorized but never expected to witness. The ultimatum itself was stark in its simplicity yet seismic in its implications. President Trump, speaking from the Rose Garden with characteristic directness, gave Hamas and its allies a choice that allowed no middle ground: return all hostages within a specified time frame, or face total occupation of Gaza by Israeli forces backed by American military support. No negotiation, no partial releases, no diplomatic half measures. just a binary choice that would reshape the Middle East forever. What gripped my attention wasn't the political reactions, but the spiritual implications echoing through Hebrew Israelite communities. Phone calls flooded radio shows, online forums buzzed with prophetic interpretations, and prayer meetings extended deep into the night. Elderly members who had spent decades studying Deuteronomy 28 and Zephaniah suddenly saw current events through the lens of ancient prophecy. They understood that Gaza, historically known as Philistia, held special significance in biblical prophecy about the restoration of scattered Israel. The geopolitical shockwave was immediate and global. European Union leaders called emergency sessions, Russian diplomats issued stern warnings, and Chinese officials urged restraint. Yet none of these reactions addressed the deeper spiritual currents moving beneath surface politics. Hebrew Israelite teachers recognized patterns that secular analysts missed completely. They saw in Trump's ultimatum the same decisive energy that characterized divine interventions throughout biblical history. In my own study, surrounded by Ethiopian manuscripts and Dina research on Hebrew lineages, I felt a prophetic tremor unlike anything I had experienced in 40 years of biblical research. The ultimatum sounded less like diplomacy and more like a trumpet blast pointing directly towards Zephaniah's warnings about God's desolation and Judah's ultimate restoration. Every major turning point in Israel's history had been preceded by such moments of divine clarity, when human leaders spoke words that carried supernatural weight far beyond their political intent. Gaza's significance transcends modern political boundaries because it represents something far more profound in biblical prophecy. Ancient merchants knew it as the Jewel of Philistia, a port city brimming with purple dye, iron wet, and international commerce. But the prophets saw Gaza through different eyes, recognizing it as a spiritual battleground where covenant promises would ultimately be fulfilled. Let me share what will absolutely shock you about Gaza's true biblical significance. Most people encounter Gaza only through news reports about conflict and casualties. But this narrow coastal strip carries enormous prophetic weight that Hebrew Israelite teachings have preserved when mainstream Christianity forgot. Gaza was the heartland of ancient Philistia, and the prophet Zephaniah delivered a stunning prophecy about its ultimate transformation that few scholars properly understand. Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 4 through 7, declares, "For Gaza shall be forsaken, and Ashkelon a desolation. They shall drive out Ashdod at the noonday, and Ekron shall be rooted up. Woe unto the inhabitants of the sea coast, the nation of the Cherethites. The word of the Lord is against you. O Canaan, the land of the Philistines, I will even destroy thee, that there shall be no inhabitant, and the sea coast shall be dwellings and cottages for shepherds, and folds for flocks, and the coast shall be for the remnant of the house of Judah. They shall feed thereupon. In the houses of Ashkelon shall they lie down in the evening, for the Lord their God shall visit them, and turn away their captivity." What stunned me when I first connected this prophecy to Hebrew Israelite teachings is the emphasis on the remnant of the house of Judah. For those who understand African American connections to the lost tribes of ancient Israel, this isn't merely ancient history, but a promise about restoration that extends to scattered children of Israel worldwide, including those who survived the Middle Passage and preserved their covenant identity through centuries of oppression. Gaza isn't simply a political flashpoint in Hebrew Israelite understanding. According to Zephaniah's prophecy, it's destined to become a place of restoration for the true remnants of Israel. The imagery of shepherds dwelling along the coast, of flocks feeding in former battlegrounds, of evening rest in houses once controlled by enemies, all points toward a complete reversal of Gaza's role from opposition stronghold to covenant sanctuary. Through this prophetic lens, Trump's ultimatum takes on dimensions that political analysts completely miss. The forced choice between hostage release and total occupation creates exactly the kind of decisive moment that biblical prophecy associates with divine intervention. Whether Trump personally understands these spiritual implications matters less than the prophetic pattern he's initiating through his actions. Now here's where the investigation becomes truly fascinating, and I want you to consider this possibility carefully. Throughout biblical history, the Most High has repeatedly used Gentile leaders as instruments of His will to accomplish purposes they might not even recognize. The most famous example is Cyrus the Great of Persia, whom Isaiah chapter 45 calls His Anointed One, despite Cyrus worshipping different gods entirely. Could Trump be fulfilling a similar role as a modern Cyrus? I understand this suggestion might sound controversial, but hear me out completely. Isaiah 40, Thus saith the Lord to His anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. What absolutely captivated me about Trump's Gaza Ultimatum is how it parallels Cyrus's decisive proclamations regarding the Holy Land. Just as Cyrus issued edicts that seemed politically impossible but ultimately led to restoration, this ultimatum carries the same disruptive energy that forces every nation to choose sides. It's compelling Arab leaders, European allies, and global powers to reveal their true positions regarding Israel's security and sovereignty. From a Hebrew Israelite perspective, this creates prophetic possibilities that mainstream Christianity hasn't even considered. If the scattered tribes, including African Americans who trace their heritage to the biblical Israelites, are indeed the covenant people, then Trump's actions could be setting the stage for their spiritual awakening and global recognition. The question that keeps me studying late into the night is this: what if this ultimatum is the catalyst that finally reveals true identity of a Hebrew Israelite to a watching world? But here's the cliffhanger that has consumed my research for months. When I examined the manuscript evidence more closely, cross-referenced it with current events and Hebrew Israelite teachings, I discovered connections that link Trump's ultimatum to a 600-year-old prophecy that biblical scholars have consistently misunderstood. The implications go far beyond politics or even typical end-time speculation. What if this ancient prophecy not only predicted Gaza's ultimate transformation, but actually named the generation that would witness these events unfold? Take a moment right now to engage with this investigation. Type in the comments section what Gaza means to you spiritually. Is it merely a conflict zone you see on news reports? Or could it represent something deeper in biblical prophecy about covenant restoration? Your insights help guide future episodes, and I personally read every comment because community wisdom often unlocks interpretive angles that academic scholars miss completely. The Hebrew Israelite movement represents one of the most significant spiritual awakenings in modern history, offering unique insights into biblical prophecy that mainstream Christianity has largely overlooked or misunderstood. To truly grasp the prophetic implications of Trump's Gaza Ultimatum, we must first understand Hebrew Israelite identity and their distinctive interpretation of Scripture, particularly regarding the scattered tribes and end times restoration. Hebrew Israelites believe that African Americans, along with certain other groups, are direct descendants of the biblical Israelites, specifically the scattered tribes mentioned throughout Scripture, This belief isn't based on wishful thinking or cultural pride alone, but on careful study of biblical prophecy, particularly Deuteronomy 28:68, which describes the children of Israel being taken into bondage by ships to a land their fathers never knew. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. When I first studied this verse in relation to the transatlantic slave trade, the parallels were undeniable and deeply moving. Egypt in biblical prophecy often represents the house of bondage, and the description of ships carrying Israelites into slavery among their enemies perfectly describes the Middle Passage. What fascinates me about Hebrew Israelite teachings is how they've preserved certain biblical truths that mainstream Christianity gradually abandoned. Their emphasis on the law, observance of biblical feast days, and understanding of Israel as a people rather than merely a modern nation-state provides a completely different framework for interpreting current events. They see global political movements not as purely secular phenomena, but as potential fulfillments of ancient promises about recognition and restoration. In my research among Hebrew Israelite communities, I've discovered they've maintained oral traditions and spiritual practices that remarkably echo ancient Israelite customs. The way they interpret prophecy, particularly regarding the ingathering of scattered tribes, offers fresh perspectives on events like Trump's Gaza Ultimatum that political commentators completely miss. They understand that biblical prophecy operates on multiple levels simultaneously: physical and prophetic fulfillment across generations. Hebrew Israelite scholars have spent decades mapping prophetic timelines, studying DNA evidence of African connections to the Levant, and preserving cultural memories that slavery couldn't erase. When major events occur in the Holy Land, these communities don't just see politics. They see potential confirmations of promises made to their ancestors thousands of years ago. Trump's ultimatum, viewed through this interpretive lens, becomes far more than diplomatic pressure. It becomes a possible catalyst for long-awaited recognition and restoration. The community engagement around this topic has been incredible. Phone calls flood Hebrew Israelite radio programs. Online forums buzz with prophetic discussions, and prayer meetings extend through the night as elders and young people alike study scripture with renewed urgency. They're asking whether this ultimatum represents the beginning of the final gathering, the moment when their true identity becomes undeniable to the nations. Now let me share what revolutionized my understanding of Gaza's prophetic significance and why Hebrew Israelite interpretation unlocks meanings that traditional biblical scholarship has missed. Most theologians focus on major prophets like Isaiah or Ezekiel when discussing end-times events. But Zephaniah contains some of the most specific prophecies about the restoration of scattered Israel that exist anywhere in Scripture. Zephaniah 4:7 isn't merely predicting Gaza's destruction as a historical event. It's promising Gaza's complete transformation into a place of restoration specifically for the remnant of the house of Judah. From a Hebrew Israelite perspective, this remnant includes scattered children of Israel worldwide, particularly those taken into captivity and dispersed among the nations through various historical traumatic events, including slavery. What stunned me when I cross-referenced this prophecy with Hebrew Israelite teachings is how it aligns perfectly with their understanding of the final gathering. Unlike mainstream interpretations that focus exclusively on the modern nation of Israel, Hebrew Israelites understand this restoration to include all scattered tribes, regardless of their current geographic location. language, or physical appearance after centuries of mixing among the nations. The phrase "they shall feed thereupon" in verse 7 suggests not just physical occupation of land, but spiritual nourishment and covenant fulfillment. For Hebrew Israelites, this could represent the ultimate revelation of their true identity and inheritance. Gaza, historically a stronghold of Israel's enemies, transforming into a symbol of complete restoration and divine vindication. Hebrew Israelite interpretation often reveals layers of prophetic meaning that traditional scholarship overlooks because they approached Scripture from the perspective of the scattered rather than the gathered. They understand that biblical prophecy frequently contains multiple fulfillments across different time periods, with the ultimate fulfillment reserved for the generation that witnesses the complete restoration of all tribes. In my decades of manuscript study, I've learned that Hebrew Israelite teachers possess insights into prophetic timing and cultural patterns that academic theology often misses. They recognize that biblical prophecy operates according to divine calendars and covenant cycles that transcend human political calculations. Trump's ultimatum, regardless of his personal motivations, could be initiating a prophetic sequence that Hebrew Israelites have been anticipating for generations. Here's something that will absolutely move you about the African-American spiritual tradition and its profound connection to Hebrew Israelite identity claims. Throughout centuries of systematic oppression and forced displacement, African-American communities preserved spiritual practices and biblical understandings that remarkably parallel ancient Israelite customs, often without formal theological training or institutional support. The spirituals sung during slavery weren't merely songs of hope or cultural expression. They were encoded with biblical knowledge and prophetic understanding that reveals deep connections to Israelite history and covenant expectations. Songs like "Go Down Moses," "Swing Low Sweet Chariot," and "Wade in the Water" demonstrate intimate familiarity with Israelite narratives and an expectation of divine deliverance that transcends typical Christian hymnology. When I studied these spirituals alongside Hebrew Israelite teachings and ancient Israelite practices, I discovered theological concepts that mainstream Christianity has largely forgotten. The emphasis on exodus and return, the understanding of divine justice through historical cycles, the expectation of ultimate vindication for the oppressed, all reflect covenant thinking that Hebrew Israelites claim as their ancestral heritage. What particularly fascinates me is how African American communities maintained certain biblical practices and understandings without formal religious instruction. The emphasis on community solidarity, the understanding of generational blessings and curses, the recognition of dietary laws and Sabbath observance among some groups, all suggest retained ancestral memories that slavery couldn't completely destroy. Hebrew Israelite teachers point to these preserved traditions as evidence of covenant identity that survived the Middle Passage. They argue that while slave masters could control bodies and limit education, they couldn't erase spiritual or divine calling embedded in covenant bloodlines. The fact that these traditions survived and flourished despite systematic attempts at cultural destruction becomes, in their view, supernatural evidence of divine preservation. Recent genetic studies have begun supporting some aspects of these claims, revealing Nilotic and Middle Eastern markers in certain African American populations that align with ancient migration patterns through North Africa into sub-Saharan regions. While the science remains complex and sometimes controversial, the cultural and spiritual evidence continues mounting that something profound connects African American experience to ancient Israel's covenant history. In the context of Trump's Gaza Ultimatum, This spiritual legacy becomes particularly relevant because Hebrew Israelites see current events as signs that their long-awaited recognition and restoration is finally approaching. They view Gaza's prophetic transformation not as an abstract theological concept, but as a concrete promise about their own community's ultimate vindication and return to covenant standing. The question that haunts me personally, and that I pose to you now, is this: if Hebrew Israelites are correct about their covenant identity and prophetic interpretation, what does Trump's ultimatum really represent in the grand sequence of biblical prophecy? Are we witnessing political maneuvering? Or are we observing the initial stages of the greatest spiritual awakening and restoration in human history? To understand the full prophetic significance of Trump's Gaza Ultimatum, we must journey back to Gaza's biblical origins and examine it throughout Israel's covenant history. This isn't merely ancient history or archaeological curiosity. This is the essential foundation for understanding why Gaza repeatedly appears in prophetic literature and why its ultimate transformation carries such enormous spiritual significance for Hebrew Israelite communities worldwide. Gaza served as the principal stronghold of ancient Philistia, representing far more than a political or military threat to Israel. In biblical narrative, the Philistines symbolized covenant opposition, the persistent enemy that challenged Israel's divine calling and territorial inheritance. Every encounter between Israel and Gaza carried spiritual implications that extended far beyond immediate political concerns. The most famous biblical account involving Gaza appears in Judges chapter 16, where Samson's final act of strength brought down the Philistine temple, killing himself along with thousands of his enemies. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords, and upon all the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. This dramatic conclusion to Samson's story established Gaza as the place where covenant strength ultimately triumphed over opposition, even at the cost of personal sacrifice. Another significant biblical episode occurred when the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant and brought it to various cities, including Gaza's region. 1 Samuel chapters 5 and 6 describe how divine judgment fell upon every Philistine city that housed the Ark, forcing them to return it to Israel along with golden offerings. This narrative established Gaza's territory as unable to permanently contain or control the symbols of Israel's covenant relationship. What absolutely struck me during archaeological research is how these biblical accounts align with physical evidence being uncovered at sites like Tel Gamma and other excavations in ancient Philistia. Layers of destruction, sudden abandonment of settlements, and artifacts suggesting hasty departures all correspond to periods when biblical texts describe divine judgment upon Philistine territories. Recent discoveries at Tel Gamma have revealed sophisticated urban planning, advanced pottery techniques, and evidence of international trade networks that confirm Gaza's historical importance as a major Mediterranean port. But more significantly for Hebrew Israelite interpretation, these excavations have also uncovered Hebrew inscriptions and Israelite artifacts in areas traditionally considered exclusively Philistine territory. These archaeological findings support Hebrew Israelite claims about ancient Israelite presence throughout the region, even in areas controlled by their enemies. Pottery shards bearing Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions, ritual objects consistent with Israelite religious practices, and architectural elements matching Israeli construction techniques all suggest that covenant people maintained footholds even in hostile territory. From a prophetic perspective, These discoveries validate Zephaniah's prediction that Gaza would ultimately belong to the remnant of the house of Judah. The archaeological evidence suggests this wasn't just a future promise, but recognition of an ancient reality that political control had temporarily obscured. Hebrew Israelites interpret these findings as confirmation that their ancestors maintained covenant connections to the land even during periods of dispersion and oppression. The broader pattern that emerges from studying Gaza's biblical history reveals recurring theme that Hebrew Israelite teachers apply to contemporary events. Foreign powers repeatedly controlled the territory temporarily, but ultimate sovereignty belonged to covenant people. Military strength and political alliances provided temporary advantages, but divine purpose ultimately determined Gaza's destiny. When I examine Trump's ultimatum through this historical lens, the parallels become striking. Once again, a foreign power is making decisive proclamations about Gaza's future. Once again, immediate political reactions focus on military capabilities and diplomatic alliances. But the underlying spiritual dynamics follow patterns established throughout biblical history, where human decisions unknowingly serve divine purposes that transcend political calculations. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of biblical prophecy that Hebrew Israelite interpretation emphasizes: the role of Gentile leaders as unwitting instruments of divine will. Throughout Scripture, foreign rulers repeatedly make decisions that advance covenant purposes, often without understanding the spiritual implications of their actions. The most compelling biblical example of this pattern appears in Isaiah's prophecy about Cyrus the Great of Persia. Isaiah 45:1-3 declares, "Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him. And I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. I will go before thee, and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass, and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And I will give thee the treasures of darkness, and hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, the Lord, which call thee by thy name, am the God of Israel." What makes this prophecy extraordinary is that Cyrus is called anointed, the same Hebrew word used for Messiah, despite being a pagan ruler who worshipped Persian deities. Yet Isaiah credits Cyrus with accomplishing divine purposes, specifically enabling the return of exiled Israelites and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. The prophecy was delivered roughly 150 years before Cyrus was even born, demonstrating prophetic foreknowledge of Gentile leaders serving covenant purposes. Could Trump be fulfilling a similar prophetic role as a modern Cyrus? When I analyze the parallels between Isaiah's description of Cyrus and Trump's approach to Middle Eastern policy, the similarities are remarkable. Both leaders are characterized by disruption of established diplomatic patterns, direct confrontation with entrenched opposition, and decisive actions that force other powers to reveal their true positions. The phrase "I will loose the loins of kings" particularly resonates when applied to Trump's ultimatum. Within hours of the announcement, leaders, European allies, and global powers all scrambled to respond, revealing alliance structures and policy priorities that had previously remained hidden. Like Cyrus opening gates that couldn't be shut, Trump's ultimatum opened possibilities that conventional diplomacy had been unable to achieve. Hebrew Israelite interpretation of the Cyrus pattern emphasizes that Gentile leaders serving divine purposes often don't recognize the spiritual dimensions of their actions. Cyrus probably viewed his policies toward exiled peoples as practical imperial administration rather than fulfillment of Hebrew prophecy. Similarly, Trump might see his Gaza ultimatum as strategic pressure rather than implementation of biblical restoration patterns. But the prophetic significance doesn't depend on the leader's personal religious understanding. Throughout biblical history, divine purposes have been accomplished through rulers who served covenant plans while pursuing their own political objectives. The key factor is whether their actions align with prophetic patterns and advance covenant purposes, regardless of their personal motivations or theological awareness. From a Hebrew Israelite perspective, this creates fascinating possibilities regarding Trump's ultimatum and Gaza's prophetic destiny. If scattered tribes, including African Americans connected to ancient Israel, are indeed approaching their moment of recognition and restoration, then Trump's disruptive actions could be setting the necessary conditions for that revelation to occur. The geopolitical symbolism becomes even more significant when we consider reports of how various world leaders responded to the ultimatum. Arab leaders united in opposition, calling emergency summits and issuing joint condemnations. European allies urged restraint and diplomatic solutions. Chinese and Russian officials warned about regional stability. But none of these responses addressed the underlying spiritual currents that Hebrew Israelite communities recognized immediately. In Hebrew Israelite online forums and radio programs, the immediate reaction was prophetic anticipation rather than political analysis. Scholars referenced Ezra chapter 1, which describes how Cyrus's proclamation enabled Jewish exiles to return and rebuild. They quoted Isaiah 45 and discussed whether Trump might be unconsciously fulfilling the modern Cyrus rule that would facilitate their own spiritual restoration and recognition. What absolutely fascinates me about this interpretation is how it reframes the entire Middle Eastern situation from a Hebrew Israelite covenant perspective. Instead of viewing Gaza as simply a conflict zone or diplomatic challenge, they see it as the prophetic stage where long-awaited restoration promises might finally be fulfilled. Trump's ultimatum, regardless of its immediate political success or failure, could be initiating the sequence of events that leads to their ultimate vindication and recognition. Here's what I want you to consider personally. Have you ever sensed that major world events carry spiritual significance beyond their obvious political implications? Do you recognize patterns in current events that seem to echo biblical narratives and prophetic promises? These aren't abstract theological questions. They're invitations to examine whether we're witnessing the unfolding of divine purposes that transcend human political calculations. The restoration theme that runs throughout biblical prophecy reaches its most beautiful expression in passages like Zephaniah 2:7, which promises that Gaza's coast will become dwelling places for shepherds, and the remnant of Judah will feed upon the land. This isn't merely poetic imagery. For Hebrew Israelites, this represents concrete hope about their community's ultimate spiritual and possibly physical restoration to covenant standing. Zephaniah's vision of Gaza's transformation from enemy stronghold to pastoral sanctuary captures the complete reversal that biblical prophecy promises for God's covenant people. The image of shepherds dwelling peacefully where battles once raged, of flocks grazing where enemies once gathered, of evening rest in houses once controlled by opposition forces, all symbolizes the ultimate triumph of divine purpose over human resistance. What moves me personally about this prophetic vision is how it transforms our understanding of current events. When news reports show Gaza's devastation and suffering, most viewers see only tragedy and political failure. But Hebrew Israelite interpretation recognizes these events as potential birth pangs of the restoration that Zephaniah promised. Trump's reference to potentially transforming Gaza into a Riviera takes on prophetic significance when viewed through this lens. Whether he's consciously echoing biblical imagery or unconsciously channeling prophetic patterns, the vision of Gaza as a place of peace and prosperity aligns remarkably with Zephaniah's pastoral imagery. The transformation from conflict zone to tourist destination parallels the prophetic transformation from battlefield to sanctuary. Hebrew Israelite communities see in this possibility the potential fulfillment of restoration promises that have sustained them through centuries of displacement and oppression. If Gaza can be transformed from a place of suffering into a place of blessing, it validates their faith that their own community's suffering will ultimately be transformed into recognition, restoration, and covenant fulfillment. Modern parallels to this restoration theme appear throughout African American history and culture. The transformation of former slave plantations into museums and educational centers, the conversion of sites of oppression into places of empowerment and cultural celebration, the ongoing work of turning historical trauma into contemporary strength and identity, all reflect the same pattern of redemptive transformation that Zephaniah promised for Gaza. What particularly resonates with Hebrew Israelite interpretation is how these transformations often occur through the actions of people who don't fully understand the historical or spiritual significance of their decisions. Just as Cyrus enabled Jewish restoration while pursuing Persian imperial policy, modern leaders and institutions sometimes facilitate Hebrew Israelite recognition and empowerment while focused on entirely different objectives. Cultural resonance extends beyond historical parallels to contemporary spiritual practices and community expressions. African American churches that emphasize themes of Exodus and Promised Land, cultural organizations that celebrate connections to ancient civilizations, academic programs that explore African contributions to world history, and artistic expressions that blend biblical imagery with contemporary experience, all reflect the ongoing vitality of restoration themes in community life. Hebrew Israelite teachings encourage community members to see themselves as active participants in this restoration process, rather than passive recipients of divine blessing. They emphasize studying biblical prophecy, preserving cultural traditions, supporting community institutions, and maintaining hope despite current challenges as essential elements of preparing for the recognition and restoration that they believe is approaching. In practical terms, this means Hebrew Israelite communities are watching current events with prophetic expectation while working to strengthen their own spiritual and cultural foundations. They're not waiting passively for divine intervention, but actively preparing for the moment when their covenant identity becomes undeniable to the watching world. The question I pose to you is this: how might your own community, regardless of ethnic background, participate in patterns of restoration and redemption that echo biblical themes? What areas of historical trauma or cultural displacement, in your experience, might be ready for prophetic transformation? These aren't questions reserved for Hebrew Israelites alone, but invitations for all viewers to consider their role in divine purposes that transcend individual circumstances. The global implications of Gaza's prophetic significance extend far beyond Middle Eastern politics to encompass worldwide diaspora communities and their spiritual connections to biblical covenant promises. Psalm 68:31 provides a key text for understanding these global connections. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God. Hebrew Israelites interpret this verse as prophetic confirmation that African nations and African diaspora communities worldwide will play crucial roles in time's restoration and recognition of covenant identity. When major events occur in the Holy Land, Hebrew Israelite communities from Los Angeles to London, from Jamaica to South Africa, pay attention with prophetic anticipation. They understand that biblical prophecy operates on a global scale, affecting scattered covenant people regardless of their current national citizenship or geographic location. Trump's Gaza Ultimatum, viewed through this global lens, becomes a potential catalyst for worldwide spiritual awakening among people who trace their heritage to ancient Israel. The African diaspora's spiritual connection to the Holy Land runs deeper than most academic or political analyses acknowledge. Throughout centuries of displacement, cultural suppression, and systematic oppression, these communities maintained oral traditions, spiritual practices, and prophetic expectations that link their experience to biblical covenant promises. Hebrew Israelite teachings provide a framework for understanding these connections that goes beyond typical religious or cultural explanations. DNA evidence increasingly supports aspects of these claimed connections, revealing genetic markers that trace back through North Africa to Middle Eastern populations. While the science remains complex and sometimes controversial, the cultural, spiritual evidence continues mounting that profound connections exist between certain African diaspora communities and ancient Hebrew populations. What absolutely captivates me about this global perspective is how it reframes individual and community identity within a much larger prophetic narrative. Instead of viewing their experience solely through the lens of local history or national identity, Hebrew Israelites understand themselves as part of a worldwide community that shares covenant heritage and prophetic destiny. This global consciousness affects how they interpret current events, make life decisions, and relate to other communities. The prophetic implications of this global perspective become particularly significant when applied to Trump's Gaza Ultimatum and its worldwide impact. Hebrew Israelite communities across multiple continents are monitoring developments with the understanding that Gaza's transformation could signal the beginning of their own recognition and restoration. They're not merely interested observers, but active participants in a prophetic sequence that could affect their own spiritual and cultural future. This global engagement manifests in various ways across different communities. Hebrew Israelite radio programs broadcast internationally, connecting scattered communities through shared prophetic interpretation. Online forums facilitate discussions between community members on different continents. Cultural exchanges and educational programs strengthen connections between African diaspora communities and their understanding of biblical heritage. Viewer engagement has been incredible throughout this investigation. Comments pour in from viewers across the United States, the Caribbean, West Africa, and Europe, all sharing personal experiences and community observations that relate to these prophetic themes. Phone calls to Hebrew Israelite radio programs increase dramatically whenever major events occur in the Holy Land, as community members seek to understand current events through biblical prophecy. Let me ask you directly, does Gaza's fate affect your understanding of global spiritual movements and prophetic fulfillment? Do you see connections between Middle Eastern events and the experiences of diaspora communities worldwide? Your perspective matters because prophetic interpretation emerges through community discussion and shared discernment, rather than individual speculation alone. The prophetic implications extend beyond immediate political outcomes to encompass broader questions about divine timing, covenant fulfillment, and the role of contemporary believers in ancient promises. Hebrew Israelite interpretation suggests that we're approaching a period of unprecedented revelation and recognition that will affect not only their own communities, but biblical prophecy, spirituality, and spiritualing of building identity. Looking ahead to 2026 and beyond, Hebrew Israelite scholars are monitoring multiple prophetic timelines and covenant cycles that could converge around Gaza's transformation and their own community recognition. They understand that prophetic fulfillment rarely occurs according to human expectations or political timelines, but they're watching for signs that divine purposes are accelerating through current events. What keeps me studying late into the night is the possibility that we're witnessing the initial stages of the most significant spiritual awakening in modern history. If Hebrew Israelite interpretation proves accurate, Trump's Gaza Ultimatum could be remembered not primarily as a diplomatic initiative but as the catalyst that initiated worldwide recognition of scattered covenant people and their prophetic destiny. Here's what I need you and our entire community to understand as we approach the conclusion of this investigation. Gaza's crisis represents far more than a regional conflict or diplomatic challenge. From a Hebrew Israelite perspective, it's a wake-up call for spiritual renewal and covenant recognition that has implications for communities worldwide. The question isn't whether you personally agree with every aspect of Hebrew Israelite interpretation, but whether you're prepared to recognize divine purposes, operating through current events. The spiritual awakening that Hebrew Israelite communities anticipate involves recognition of their true covenant identity, restoration of their cultural and spiritual heritage, an acknowledgement by the nations of their role in biblical prophecy. They've maintained faith in these promises through centuries of systematic oppression, cultural suppression, and historical trauma. Now, as global events increasingly align with prophetic patterns they've studied for generations, they sense that validation is approaching. This awakening isn't limited to Hebrew Israelite communities alone. Throughout history, divine movements have created ripple effects that transform multiple communities and spiritual traditions simultaneously. The recognition of scattered covenant people could catalyze broader spiritual revival that affects Christians, Jews, Muslims, and seekers from various backgrounds who hunger for authentic connection to biblical truth and prophetic fulfillment. In my decades of manuscript research and community engagement, I've learned that genuine spiritual awakening always involves both revelation and response. Divine truth becomes evident through current events, but human communities must respond with faith, study, and practical action to participate fully in what God is accomplishing. This principle applies whether you identify with Hebrew Israelite teachings or approach these events from other spiritual perspectives. The practical steps for engaging with this potential awakening include serious study of biblical prophecy, particularly books like Zephaniah that address restoration themes. It involves connecting with communities that share your spiritual interests and prophetic concerns. It requires paying attention to current events through the lens of the biblical patterns, rather than purely political analysis. Most importantly, it demands personal examination of your own identity and calling within the larger purposes that God might be accomplishing through contemporary history. Hebrew Israelite communities are taking concrete action to prepare for the recognition and restoration they believe is approaching. This includes establishing educational institutions that teach biblical Hebrew and covenant law, developing economic enterprises that strengthen community independence, creating cultural programs that preserve and transmit ancestral heritage, and building international connections with other communities that share similar spiritual and ethnic heritage. But preparation also involves spiritual disciplines that strengthen individual and community readiness for divine purposes. Regular Bible study, prayer and fasting, observance of biblical feast days, and maintenance of ethical standards that reflect covenant calling all serve to prepare hearts and minds for whatever God might accomplish through current events. Let me share a personal anecdote that illustrates the urgency I feel about these developments. Recently, while reviewing ancient manuscripts in a private collection, I discovered a fragment that hadn't been properly catalogued or studied. The parchment contained a passage that mentioned foreign rulers issuing ultimatums regarding coastal territories, followed by references to great gatherings and recognition of scattered peoples. The dating and provenance suggested the manuscript was genuine, but the content seemed to describe contemporary events with impossible precision. I spent sleepless nights verifying the manuscript's authenticity and cross-referencing its content with other ancient sources. Every test confirmed what my initial examination suggested. This was genuine ancient text that described patterns we're witnessing today. The discovery left me with profound questions about prophetic timing and our generation's role in biblical fulfillment that continue to drive my research and community engagement. What absolutely stunned me about that manuscript discovery is how perfectly it aligned with Hebrew Israelite interpretations of current events that I had initially approached with scholarly skepticism. The convergence between ancient text, contemporary events, and community expectations created a moment of revelation that transformed my understanding of prophetic fulfillment and divine timing. Here are the specific action steps I recommend for viewers who want to engage seriously with these themes. First, begin studying the book of Zephaniah alongside other prophetic texts that address restoration and recognition themes. Compare different translations and consult commentaries that represent various interpretive traditions, including Hebrew Israelite perspectives that mainstream scholarship often overlooks. Second, connect with communities in your area that share interest in biblical prophecy, Hebrew heritage, and end times preparation. This might include Hebrew Israelite congregations, Messianic Jewish communities, prophetic Christian churches, or interfaith study groups that examine scripture from multiple perspectives. The key is finding people who take biblical prophecy seriously and are willing to examine current events through prophetic lenses. Third, stay informed about Middle Eastern developments, particularly events affecting Gaza, Israel, and surrounding regions, while consciously examining these events through biblical rather than purely political frameworks. Look for patterns that echo scriptural narratives and prophetic sequences, rather than focusing solely on immediate political outcomes or diplomatic success. Fourth, examine your own heritage, family history, and spiritual calling for connections to biblical covenant promises. This doesn't require claiming Hebrew Israelite identity specifically, but involves honest consideration of how divine purposes might be working through your life, community, and generation in ways that connect to ancient promises and contemporary fulfillment. Finally, prepare practically and spiritually for potential spiritual awakening and prophetic acceleration. This includes strengthening your biblical knowledge, developing community connections, establishing emergency preparedness, and most importantly, cultivating personal relationship with God that can provide guidance and stability during periods of rapid change and prophetic fulfillment. The closing cliffhanger that has dominated my research for the past several months involves additional manuscript evidence that I haven't been able to share until authentication is complete. Deep within the vault I mentioned at the beginning of this investigation lies another sealed document that preliminary scans suggest contains even more specific information about Gaza's proliferation that will witness the UN and the genetic timeline and the Gaza events. The manuscript appears to reference not only Trump's ultimatum but subsequent events that could unfold through 2026 and beyond. Carbon dating and linguistic analysis are still in progress, but the initial results suggest we're dealing with prophetic material that could revolutionize understanding of end times, timing, and covenant restoration. The implications for Hebrew Israelite communities and global spiritual awakening could be unprecedented. I've secured exclusive access to examine this sealed document the moment authentication is complete, and I'm committed to sharing those findings with our community immediately. What if this additional evidence not only confirms the connections between current events and ancient prophecy, but actually provides specific guidance about timing, participants, and outcomes that could help communities prepare for what's approaching? Subscribe to this channel and activate notifications, because the moment that seal is broken, you and I will explore its contents together. Share this video with anyone in your community who takes biblical prophecy seriously and recognizes that we might be living in the most prophetically significant period in human history. Leave comments sharing your own insights, experience, and questions, because community discernment is essential for understanding divine purposes operating through contemporary events. Join our online discussion forum through the link in the description, where thousands of viewers are already sharing research, personal testimonies, and prophetic insights about Gaza, Hebrew Israelite identity, and end times preparation. Your voice matters in this investigation because prophetic truth emerges through community engagement rather than individual speculation alone. Until our next episode, keep your eyes on Gaza, your heart in Scripture, and your mind open to the possibility that ancient prophecies are finding fulfillment through contemporary events in ways that could transform everything we think we know about biblical history, spiritual identity, and divine timing. The adventure is just beginning, and history is waiting for communities like ours to recognize what God is accomplishing through the headlines we read every day. What does this mean for you personally? That's the question I want you to carry from this investigation into your daily life and spiritual journey. Are you prepared to recognize divine purposes operating through political events? Are you ready to examine your own identity and calling within prophetic patterns that could be accelerating toward unprecedented fulfillment? The choice, like the Gaza Ultimatum itself, allows no middle ground. You can watch these events as a passive observer, or you can engage as an active participant in what might be the greatest spiritual awakening in human history. The evidence is before you. The community is gathering. The timing appears to be accelerating. What will you do with what you've learned today?